Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon at TAFAF. My name is Ed Behrens. I'm the editor of Apollo magazine. I am thrilled to be joined on the stage by two curators from the Princeton University Art Museum. We have Alexandra Foradas, who is the Haskell Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, and Karl Kusserow, who is the John Wilmerding Senior Curator of American Art. We are talking about this museum because it reopens in October after quite the makeover. It's slightly more fundamental than a makeover, which we'll get into in some time. So I think before we begin, I think it's worth saying that Ali is something of a new recruit. Am I allowed to put it like that?
Yes.
And has been at the museum for how many?
Officially now 8 weeks. So ask me all the questions about the history and I will lie to you through my teeth. No, I'm teasing.
And Karl is a senior curator who has all the institutional knowledge we could dream of. So from these very different perspectives, what is it like for a curator to be working on a project where everything is new? In some sense, this could have been a completely blank canvas. When did you get involved and what was it like for you?
Hi, everyone. Happy Mother's Day to some of you. Good to be here. And thanks, Ed, for that question. I think new might even be tweaked to say different in a sort of broader sense. And I say that by way of noting what you referenced, which is that we are really beginning anew in that most museums, including our own, until about 5 years ago, was sort of an accretion of different spaces. We have been an institution for almost 150 years and were founded just a few years after the great comprehensive museums of the 1870s, the Met and the MFA Boston. And like them, as a result, we started out with a small building, which was then added to, I think, 3 or 4 times over the course of decades. And the result was, as elsewhere, I think, spaces that were in many ways, I won't say quite compromised, but had their own character and were sometimes a challenge to work in and with for that reason, because they weren't holistically planned. And what we're doing now is a kind of tabula rasa. We have taken down the old building in its entirety and built a brand new one in its place, much bigger. And so things are not only new, but very different in that sort of broader sense. And one way I suppose that you could get at that is numerically. I had in the old building a gallery, and I use that in the singular. It was a big room, but lots of doorways, so not much linear feet, places to hang things, in which we could accommodate perhaps 50 objects, and we would rotate aggressively to try to bring to bear some of the depth of the collection that wasn't, as a result of that scale, otherwise available to visitors. But nonetheless, it was really inadequate for the depth and breadth of our collection. And in the new space, by contrast, if you consider as well the adjacent galleries of Native American and Latin American art, that number is more like 400 objects. So it's a real paradigm shift in addition to being new. And that, as those numbers might suggest, enables us to be far more broad in what we're displaying. So the adjacent galleries of Native American and Latin American art are the first time in our history that we've really had not only separate spaces for these collections, but also really the wherewithal to display them in any depth in the first place. And that same expansive range extends as well to the media that we're able to display. I had a fairly traditional gallery of paintings and sculpture, and we now have all sorts of works on paper. We have a wonderful photography collection. We have decorative arts out for the first time, really, in numbers, and those things are also sort of bolstered by an enhanced range of cultural breadth. So I mentioned Native American and Latin American. We have much more in the way of the work of African American artists. We have far more women artists on view. So we're able now to really do things that we weren't before. And the last thing I would say is that the spaces are that much bigger that we can be, and I think Ali would agree, we can start to be intentional on the floor of the gallery and with the installation, so that whereas previously I was trying hard just to get what I could into a tight space, we can now sort of make arguments on the floor or pose questions and think very intentionally about how we're displaying the works in our collection. And that is all very much a new thing and different, so both.
So you mentioned breadth and numbers, but did it change the way you actually think about the collection at a fundamental level? And Ali, I know you will have been approaching this from a sort of external perspective, but now that you're thinking about how this goes together and in some sense taking on a vision, but has it transformed the way you're thinking about that collection?
I think it does, because with more space, to Karl's point, you don't have to be quite so elbows out, I think, about making sure that your collecting area for which you are responsible is able to speak with coherency. It feels a little bit easier to develop that coherency with more space. And not only to ask questions internally of that collecting area, but also to ask questions of each other across spaces, so that there are moments when modern and contemporary work, for example, might be on view in the American galleries in beautiful ways. There's a wonderful table and chairs sculptural by Hugh Locke that was collected from an artist who had an exhibition while the museum was closed at a small off-site location. So it offers opportunities to not only be a bit broader within each space, but also to underscore some of those conversations that have been happening as the museum's doors haven't been open. That doesn't mean people have stopped working, right?
Yeah. Yes. And Karl, did you begin to rethink your area in any way? Did the architectural process force you to reconsider what your collection was at some fundamental level?
Yeah, indeed. And as suggested by the earlier response, just the scale really enables things that were not possible before. And so this is, of course, very much in keeping with the way people in my field, which is, American art, are thinking about their sort of purview, which is to say a move away generally from a Eurocentric representation of what is now the United States historically, and an embrace more broadly of sort of hemispheric orientation. And with that, more attention as well to indigenous cultures. And so what we're doing now is trying, and it's tricky because ideas about the world change a lot faster, happily, I think, ultimately, but in the case of being a curator, with somewhat makes it difficult, than collections do. So that what we've accumulated over the course of 150 almost years are objects that reflect the interests and the sort of biases, I suppose, of people who were working on the collection prior to me. And yet, at the same time, we are really trying with this new space to think much more expansively about what we're displaying. So we do have works that would not, in your sort of grandfather's installation of American art, been there.
So I was going to bring this up a little further on into the conversation, but since we're touching on it, let me ask you, this work obviously began quite some time ago. The decision to start again, in one sense, is an old one, and this is 6 years in the making as a project, or even longer, depending how you look at it. Obviously, in that time, the administration that this museum is taking place under has changed, and the political conversation has changed enormously. I think many people probably thought it was heading in one direction for good, and that seems to be less true. So how has the political, let's call it conversation generously, shifted what you're doing or changed the accent of what you're doing at the museum?
I think for the most part, I'm happy to say that I've watched colleagues stay the course, that I haven't watched them vastly rewrite the conversations that they're hoping to have. They've been thinking in ways that are on a grand timeline in many cases,
yes,
and are facilitating conversations within their gallery spaces with objects that feel relevant today and felt relevant a year or two ago.
Yeah.
One of the things that I love about the university museum model in particular is that it is a space that welcomes questioning.
Yes.
And I think, as Karl is saying, the galleries with increased space offer more room for those types of conversations. Yeah. It's exciting to see the ways in which the collection has grown while we were closed. There are many more Indigenous artists represented, especially in the modern and contemporary galleries, than I think would have even been in the collection, let alone on view previously, and many more works by women and queer folks as well. The plan for those galleries hasn't changed. Celebrating those artists feels important, and maybe even more so now. And I'm proud of the fact that the institution has stayed the course in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I would say personally, I have altered things not at all. And part of that is the planning horizon was simply years, not weeks or months. And since whatever happened on January 20th of this year, we actually began installing my galleries just a few weeks later. So that's not to say, had we had another year, that I would have changed anything, or that would have been interesting, or the institution would have had an interest in that. I think we've all seen in not so much months or even years, but in recent decades, a real paradigm shift in museums and how they have moved from the sort of temples of culture and effete elite orientation to places that engage questions of citizenship and civics and justice and morals and ethics and
what it means to be American.
Indeed, yeah, and those are things that were ongoing, and I think really in the past decade picked up steam with Black Lives Matter and the Sunrise Movement and Me Too, race, gender, the environment. These are all things that have come to the fore and that people, I think, appreciate not sort of ignoring in museum culture. And so those three things are actually the sort of through lines, as Ali knows, in my gallery. And there are things that were set in place, not so much because of whatever administration may currently sort of hold the White House, but rather because part of the larger transformation, which I think is a very beneficial one in museum culture, is toward a more holistic embrace of what it means to be human and what it means to be a citizen, as against a sort of refined approach to beautiful and important and skilled things, which we can still appreciate as such, but that you can bring a whole other dimension to them. And that's what we're, I think, all trying to do.
Great. So then my next question is at one level much simpler and at another much more complicated, which is how much influence did you have on the space itself? If somebody, I think a lot of people don't have a very clear idea of how a museum, when you're starting from scratch, can be designed. So at what stage does the architect make the tentative approach to curators? How does that exchange of information and placing of walls begin?
Sure, this is a tough question.
It's a tough one for Ali. Ali has
for Ali,
But I like the idea of you walking in 3 weeks before opening and saying, I just want to pull this down.
Yeah.
It would be sort of on brand, but I didn't do that, which is a tribute to the space that's been designed. Yeah.
Maybe one way to approach that is to step back a little bit and just orient you all somewhat to the larger project. I mentioned that we took the old building down in its entirety, with one exception, which is that the Marquand Art Library, which is one of the world's great institutions of its type, had recently been refurbished, and we wanted, the university wanted, for good reason, to not tear that down as well. And so that became one of what is now 9 so-called pavilions in the architect's rhetoric, which is to say 3 rows of 3 semi-discrete spaces, each of which was meant in some way to serve a particular function. So one of them is, for example, the conservation studio. We have a state-of-the-art studio, which our conservators are very eager to get into because we've been lacking that for as long as I've been at the museum. But other spaces are dedicated to particular types of art. And part of what went where was determined by the nature of those individual pavilions. So the ones around the perimeter, for example, have high ceilings and wonderful natural light. So for that reason, it made sense to put modern and contemporary in one of those, American in another, whereas in the core of the museum, where collections, which are some of our best collections, really, our Art of Ancient Americas is one of the world's best collections of that material. And that went into the core because of the lower ceilings and you don't need natural light in the same way. So part of the way this was determined was simply by virtue of what made sense for that particular part of the floor plan. And then within, though, I think your question in a way is how did we as individual curators get to determine the nature of our own spaces? And to that end, I'm pleased to say we had a real hand in that process, which began really with a series of working groups that we all convened in our individual areas. In my case, we had one for American art generally, we had one for African American, Native American, Latin American, and these were groups of individuals from the university, from beyond the university, from the staff, who all met and discussed at that point during the pandemic over Zoom most of the time, how we could best present those collections. And that resulted, in my case, in an orientation in the pavilion proper of not one, but rather 5 distinct galleries. And as I mentioned earlier, those are sort of entered and exited from galleries of Native American art and Latin American art. And one of the things that I think are particularly pleased with is that you enter the American so-called pavilion through the Native American gallery. So that implicit in that, I think, is an avowal of the reality that we are not, as Euro-Americans that were colonists, we are not the first peoples to inhabit this place. And to underscore that through the experience of engaging those cultures, I think is really powerful.
Similarly, I love that you make your way through much of the history of art before you hit modern and contemporary.
Yeah.
There is, even for the person who's never been to a museum before, should such a person visit our museum, you get a mini visual education in the history of art, such that you're encountering ancient mosaics, ancient Mesoamerican art, art of the Americas, Islamic art, all before you would hit the modern contemporary pavilion. Which, by the way, I think, to respond to your question, Ed, one of the things that I love about that space is that it has 18-foot high ceilings. I'm coming from an institution, Mass MoCA in Western Mass, where I've been for the past 11 years, which is an old factory space. Many of our spaces have had 3-story tall ceilings. And I watched the ways in which large spaces, large ceilings, encourage artists to dream on a larger scale and to think about ways of engaging the architecture that really involves people in the work, right, rather than letting the work sit separately from them. So I love that when you finally make your way to the modern and contemporary pavilion, we now have a space that welcomes that type of thinking. And in fact, at its core has a large installation by an Inupiaq artist at its current center, with which we will open. Yeah.
Amazing. And presumably you're now dreaming of what you can do with 18-foot high ceilings, and that is the joy of the gig.
It's very exciting. Yes, I should say that should you visit us, which I hope you do, after we open on October 31st, the installation that you will see in the modern and contemporary galleries is primarily the brainchild of my predecessor, Mitra Abaspour, who is now the modern and contemporary art curator at the Harvard Art Museum. There are little bits and pieces of me that you might see in that space, but truly properly, if you would like to be in conversation with my curatorial brain such that it is, I hope that you come back a year later as well and revisit that space once I get to make some of those choices that you're talking about.
So one of the other interesting things about the Princeton University Art Museum is that obviously it is a university art museum. And I'm always very intrigued by university museums because they seem to have a dual purpose. One is to communicate directly with that university body, the audience, both professorial and student body, as well as the function of engaging with the wider audience. And I'm just sort of intrigued about how you both think about that, consider it, whether it changes things or not, and also how the new building plays into that.
For myself, I would say curatorial work for me is an extension of thinking about teaching. It's thinking about teaching and questioning and making arguments in space. And so the biggest question then is who your audience is, or audience singular are. Our first and biggest audience, of course, is, as you're saying, Princeton faculty, Princeton students, as well as community members. What that means for me as I think about the permanent collection galleries especially, is a thinking around themes and a deep love of the fact that I now get to be in conversation with the fantastic faculty and students within the art and archaeology departments, as well as across literature and film and science. I am lucky to have a gallery space that has what is essentially 8 nodes geographically. It's divided up into sort of little rooms rather than the 4 big galleries that Karl is responsible for. And that means that I'm getting to pull out themes that feel relevant to coursework, things like our relationship to war and violence, our relationship to abstraction and line and mark making. As I think about how to use these nodes, I can pick 7 things at a time within our collection that allow for storytelling that I hope will be generative based on the classes that I know are coming up, but which I think would be generative and exciting for a layperson too. Because I'm coming out of a context where my primary audience would have not necessarily been an academic one, that will always, and I think has always influenced my approach. It's nice to bring in a little bit more of that dialogue with my university compatriots. Yeah. What about?
I would say, Ed, maybe that I don't see it so much as a dichotomy. Not necessarily that you were suggesting that, but
I mean, I might have been. I'm a journalist. I go for simplistic arguments.
You're trying to get the facts down. Yeah, I tend to think of museums, whether sort of civic or academic, as sort of existing on a spectrum, and the people who visit them, the people who work in them and curate them, are really engaging things differently among themselves as groups. And I think that the academic piece, in a way, sort of expands maybe that spectrum. And to that end, in terms of the core function of that piece of our institution, we've gone to great lengths to make what is already a very dynamic resource center with not just our museum, but the Department of Art and Archaeology, which is in the same building. I mentioned the art library, the Index of Christian Art. So within the sort of ensemble of institutions is really a pretty significant body of knowledge and thought and research about visual culture. And to engage that in terms of research, we have all sorts of spaces where people can now do that kind of work, and those spaces double as well as spaces for teaching, which is something that is very much central to our mission and something that we do and something that, of course, the faculty does. But as far as the sort of public-facing piece, first of all, we're always free all the time, which is something that I'm proud to be able to say and that we can't all say, those of us who work at museums. And so that in itself, I think, is meaningful in terms of how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the sort of outside world. But what we try to do, I think, as existing on this larger spectrum of museums, but within, as you're suggesting, a sort of academic side of things, is to create exhibitions and programs and more public-facing things that partake of that academic orientation in being rigorous, I think, scholarly, I think innovative, but at the same time we go to great lengths to be accessible. And that's a challenge, but I think it's one that we've been at for a while and have done pretty well with. And I think, in a way, the numbers sort of bolster that contention, because when I, 20 years ago, started working at the Princeton University Art Museum, we would have perhaps 80,000 visitors a year. When we closed, as a result of the pandemic, we had, I think, 230,000 a year. And I believe that the projection, once we're open, is something like 350,000. So something seems to be working, and that balance somehow seems to be possible between, on the one hand, the community that you're surrounded by, the academic community, and on the other hand, the people that you really want to bring into that community through the programming and the exhibitions you do, and to try to do so in a way that respects that setting, but also speaks in ways that people can understand and engage and benefit from.
So can we talk about something which I think we discussed when we were preparing for this, which is, you mentioned teaching, and there's the matter of interpretation, by which I mean wall text, labels, how you are being didactic around your works of art to the public face. How do you approach, as an institution, how do you approach what is professionally called interpretation, but is wall labeling, essentially? As an institution?
many of the objects in our spaces have their own didactic labels, which for me is new, by the way. I am coming from a context which welcomed larger essays around exhibitions, which were in publications that were free to the public. But individual works rarely had discursive labels, which is to say the label wouldn't describe the work, it would just be artist, title, date, materials, lender. One of the things that I love about the fact that we include more interpretation is that because we're within an academic setting, there are students who genuinely need to be able to walk into the gallery and to understand the context from which the object is coming. It serves a really particular purpose in that regard. The flip side is that we are starting to think more, I think, institutionally, especially in the permanent collection galleries, which Karl is doing beautifully in his spaces, about thematic areas where there is an argument being made within a section of the museum. And that might get a label that stretches across a dozen, 24, hundreds of works. Those are the didactics that I am the most excited about watching emerge. I think by virtue of this new and larger space, we have more opportunities to make curatorial arguments in space in that way. Yes. And that those panels allow people, they let us show our work, I guess.
Which in some ways is quite radical. I mean,
yes.
Obviously within museum running now, there is enormous debate about how interpretative, how interventionist to be. But, and there is a school of curators who will say, you make your argument by placing one thing next to another.
Total self-abnegation.
And that is it.
Yeah. Yes.
So this is more radical than it might seem,
yes.
I think. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, not at all. And I think to that good point, it is also, there are moments when you are making these arguments truly cross-temporally, diachronically, globally. There are a number of galleries within the space that juxtapose ancient and contemporary works, which is also a bit unusual, yes. We'll say, new for museum practice. And the interpretation work that we are doing is in part to help people understand why we're making those choices, yes. So that they can feel free to disagree with us if they want to. We hope that they will.
Which comes back to your point about questioning as an environment.
Exactly.
So disagreement is welcome. This is not.
I hope so.
Yeah. Karl, do you want to weigh in?
I just add that one of the nice things about having a sort of a long runway to get ourselves oriented as they were building the museum and as the pandemic was, sort of playing out, was that we were able, in some cases, to sort of share our collections with audiences that, rather than put them in storage for 5 years. And that, in my case, resulted in an exhibition called Object Lessons in American Art, which, as Ali is indicating, allowed in my case, sort of a dry run for what I had in mind for the American galleries in the building, which is to say, a exhibition oriented around groups of objects, so that instead of placing your 150-word label text next to every object and moving in a sort of stepwise fashion down a wall or through a space, you're encouraged in these galleries to engage groups of objects, which the idea is will in some way both be able to be appreciated in and of themselves, but also in sort of juxtaposition will mean something a little bit different or a little bit maybe more than they would singly. And I can give you a brief example. I have a quadrant, a quadrangle of 18th century portraits. 3 of them men, 1 of a woman. The 3 men are each writing, which was a marker then of literacy, of course, but also sort of wealth and class and success in a certain sense. The woman, by contrast, who, as it happens, it was a woman named Annis Boudinot, who was a friend and frequent correspondent of George Washington and a published poet. In other words, the most literate of the group, is portrayed with a very low-cut dress, a sort of small bouquet of flowers signifying fertility, and completely devoid of the intellectual sort of accoutrements that were very much, probably more a part of her life than those of the three men surrounding her. So the point is that if you put those together, you can make points that you can't in sort of in that sort of stepwise manner of usually presenting things. And that's really the way, for my pavilion anyway, that things are oriented. And I think there's some of that going on elsewhere, including, in Allie's space.
So we're getting close to the end of our conversation, and I just want to touch on a slightly less happy question, which is, obviously, as you've mentioned, this is a very old collection in the country. Museums that have collections that are that old struggle with provenance, or the demands of provenance that have arisen recently. So I sort of just wanted to ask you about, and I know it's not particularly an area of either of your expertise, and one of you don't need to worry about it too much at all, but about restitution and how the museum is approaching that sort of age-old subject going forwards into its new guise.
Sure. Maybe a way to approach that is to think about how, as we discussed, museums are changing and are becoming more engaged with questions of right and wrong and sort of good citizenship. And that being the case, it would make sort of no sense if provenance and restitution didn't become a part of the conversation that we're all, as museums, having. And you're right, we've been collecting for a long time in ways as sort of varied as there are objects in our care. And as a result of that, there are works which we are in the process or already have restituted to various entities. I'm working on one right now, an important Native American artifact, which is going back to its source community, and which is the first, in my case, instance of that happening. And I must say, although we're losing something from our collection, in one sense, it feels very good in another, I think, more important sense, to be involved with that process. But we're taking it all, as we should, seriously. We hired recently our first curator of provenance, who is working with us as individual curators, and I have had a couple of grad students helping with provenance, and in my, and I think Allie's field, it's not as much at issue as it is in some of the other areas of collecting, where ancient materials, for example, or materials that might have issues with Nazi provenance, are more European art, are more sort of at issue. Nonetheless, we're all, each of us, been in the first instance tasked with having provenance information for every object that's on view when we open, and more broadly, ultimately, we'll do provenance research on all 120,000 objects in the collection, and we're publishing them on our website. And we're being, I think, lastly, much more mindful in terms of acquisitions, not only by purchase, but by donation, of the histories of these objects, so that we can be sure that we're acting in ways that are in accord with the new thinking about who is really sort of able and entitled in a moral universe to steward these things that in many cases have challenging histories.
I think it's worth saying that those questions of stewardship and provenance make their way into some of the ways that we think about interpretation institutionally. So perhaps one way of understanding why we care so much about all of this is that as we tell the story of how these objects move through the world, they live their own lives, these sort of, wayward, different temporalities than a human life. And what they mean to us changes as they change hands. How they mean changes as they change hands. And our ability to be good stewards of them and to accurately tell their stories is shaped by our ability to know those stories and to know whether we kind of came into them in right relation to that history or not. So useful in that way too, I think.
Yes, excellent. Well, I think that's probably a good moment for us to take a pause and turn to the audience and see if anybody has any questions for our panelists. Could I just say there are microphones roaming, so if you can wait till you have a microphone, that would be great. There's someone at the back there.
We arrived a little bit late, but I'm kind of an Ivy geek. So my question kind of surrounds, compared to most of the other Ivies, what differentiates your collection and your history as a university and your approach towards art history and such? I hope that makes sense. What differentiates you guys, I guess? Like what's so Princeton about your collection?
I can maybe take a crack at that. What are there, 8, 7, I can't remember, Ivy League schools, and really, although I'll probably hear from colleagues, the 3 of them have what might be called, we don't use the word encyclopedic anymore, comprehensive collections, which is to say they have strength in a range of different areas. And those, maybe not surprising to you, are Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I would say, coming from my perspective as an Americanist, the collection at Yale is one of the best in the world in my field. And as that might suggest, Yale and Harvard, I would say, tend to be stronger in areas that are kind of what you might call traditional areas of collecting, European, American. Princeton has its strengths in areas that are perhaps a little bit less expected. So I mentioned initially that the Art of the Ancient Americas is a truly world-class collection. Our photography collection is one of the best in the country. Our collection of Asian art is extraordinary, particularly Chinese art. And a lot of that has to do, as in any institution, with the sort of history of, in our case, not just the curation of the collection, but also of the academic interests of the faculty, who, when the museum was much smaller, had a much larger hand in how things were acquired. But I guess I would say that among those 3 institutions that you might consider in some sense comprehensive museums, Princeton's strengths are in those areas where you might not expect them, so to speak, and that's really, I think, one of the nice distinctive things about the museum. You can see things there that you wouldn't otherwise see, probably.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
A question about trends in installation. A number of American museums and also the National Gallery in London, for example, will install American pictures with European pictures, hang them together. And I think that usually happens when an American artist has gone abroad and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. But you're seeing late 19th century pictures, American and European, hung together. Are you doing something like that?
Thanks for the question. In our case, I would say that the expansion in at least the American galleries is a little bit more in the way of sort of north and south, as against, over to Europe. There are, I think, a few European objects in the spaces that I've curated, but it's really much more the case that we're exhibiting things that come from Latin America, things that come from Northwest Coast indigenous cultures. And in the case of the European galleries, I guess the answer is similar. We do have an artist or two who sort of straddle that divide. So we have a wonderful Sargent portrait, which in a way is sort of dodging the question by being placed in an orientation gallery, which is neither European nor American. But generally speaking, the move that we're making, at least in the American area, is to look at the hemisphere a little bit more broadly, as against the European roots or linkages of the Euro-American collection.
Yeah. So it's really about the nature of your collection.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we're pleased at last to have the space and beginning to gather the knowledge to be able to responsibly display some of the works in our collection that come from groups that were not accorded that space in the past. And by that I mean in particular Native American cultures, but also giving really due space to other groups, and I've notably a separate gallery now for Latin American art.
It should also be noted that while the permanent collection galleries fall more along those hemispheric and geographic lines, we have a number of rotating exhibition spaces that curators will treat thematically, which I think it's fair to say in fairly short order will combine the work of artists from Europe, from America, during those time periods that you're asking about. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how curators and curatorial staff are engaging with, I don't know if you call them education or engagement departments, how you're working with them about the programming to kind of reintroduce and reintegrate your audiences to the new museum and the exhibitions that'll be there.
It's a great question. I'll take one crack at it, and then Karl will probably have different answers as well. So for me, my first work out of undergrad was in public programs. I made my way into curatorial work somewhat sideways. And so thinking about intersections of public programs as well as performance with visual art and exhibition making has always been part of how my curatorial brain works. It's really exciting to me that our public programs team is open to that kind of thinking and doesn't feel as though I'm stepping on their turf. One of the exciting sort of seeds of conversations that we've been having over the past couple of months while I've been there has been around thinking about themes that can be drawn out of the permanent collection spaces, especially, and then looking down towards my own first sort of big exhibition that'll open about a year from now, thinking about thematic links both within their own thinking as well as within upcoming coursework at the university, and programming things that are not just an artist's talk, for example, which is great, but that might also sort of use the ideas within the exhibition as a jumping off point to welcome in performance, to welcome in thinkers from outside of art and art history into the galleries as appropriate. So I think a real enthusiasm for that type of collaboration with our public programs team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could just add maybe in two ways. On a sort of intra-institutional sense, meaning Princeton University, we have a great curator of academic programming who sort of minds the programming that we have put forth, including the exhibitions, and reaches out very actively to members of the teaching faculty to engage them in what we're doing, and really vice versa. And I think your question as well was how we sort of liaise really with the educational department more broadly. And I would say that really just about everything we sort of put out there is vetted, has sort of improved by, let's say, engagement with our colleagues in education who in the case of, say, a label, we spoke about labels, those go through several rounds of edits prior to being put on the wall. And the point there is to take what we might in some ways take for granted and to put them through the minds of and the eyes of professionals who have a better understanding, I think, for what our audiences might come equipped with, and help us bridge that gap in ways that make the final product a lot more
accessible,
meaningful, and a lot more accessible.
Thank you. Is there, forests of hands. The lady in the red hat. The microphone is just there.
Thank you for this presentation to all three of you. I was an undergraduate at Princeton in the 80s, and I spent many, many hours at Marquand and the Art History Library, rather the Art Museum, much more than at my dorm. And I was part of the student body that was a club, you know, the Friends of the Art Museum that has turned into something else today. But Miss Ali, I don't know what they've done with the bathrooms now, but I had to share something with you. This was a throwback from when the professors were mostly men, and their wives had to be on campus. They wanted to be on campus, and they couldn't have a place. They couldn't chat in the library. They couldn't chat in the museum. So the woman's bathroom was a lounge.
Incredible.
A lounge, and it had sofas. It had cocktail table. It was all in the 60s. It was a throwback to me already in the 80s. And I was busy undergrad. I had no business lounging in the bathroom. But when one would get sick, when one would have cramps, when one would fall ill, that's where you went, and it was so comfortable. So I'm gonna miss that. But more seriously, I loved the intimacy of the old museum. You could really approach objects very directly, and they were also contextualized. And so I'm hoping with the new array that some of that is not fully lost, because when spaces expand, so might experience, right, in good ways. But if you lose the intimacy of your encounter with the objects, that's something else to remember. And then I also remember the feel. It wasn't like in many museums that one might attend today, and I travel the world going to museums. It was a place where you went in and you felt like you're here to learn. You're here to be transformed. And I hope that doesn't get lost with the new spacing and the new dynamics, because that is an unbelievable feel, and that it can happen, right? That you could really, really be there and be transformed and learn, rather than just consumer-like say, oh, I saw that, or I saw this, or I saw that. So akin to your question is the interpretive framework that might be offered in the new museum for lay people, for experts, for students, so that that attention to learning, not just the luxury or the excitement of accessing these incredible objects, that can still be retained or offered through interpretive framework somehow.
I think that there are two things that are really resonating with what you're saying. The first is that feeling of sort of delight in the discovery that happens when you are within a space where you know you're meant to be looking closely, and you're invited into intimacy with work, which, as you're saying, can be really hard in cavernous spaces. one of the things that I really treasure is that, as Karl sort of pointed towards, but I think it's worth underscoring, a number of the spaces they're narrower with lower ceilings, and that feels a bit like a way of honoring some of what was beautiful about the old space. These hallways that have a lower ceiling that ask you to come into closer contact with the work because you almost have no other option. The space is small enough that it demands that from you. And I love that we will have the opportunity to work both in that type of space and in more expansive ones. I also think that, to your good point about enthusiasm around setting that tone, around learning, looking closely, and the sort of comparison that happens as we learn across objects and across a space, that is actually one of the reasons that I really love the ability to think more thematically in this new space and to draw connections between objects, and the welcoming approach that colleagues in education as well as in curatorial are taking to didactics and to tours perhaps that draw some of those themes together across the museum even, not just within a single gallery. That with a little bit more space, if perhaps you lose some of that, the tiny jewel box-like quality, you gain the ability to say, oh, I was just in that space and I saw an artist thinking about ways of representing nature, and now I'm in this new space and I'm seeing this other thing. We're hoping to find ways to draw some of those intimacies intellectually, even if the spaces don't always feel quite so intimate. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as well, when you visit, you'll find that we haven't, I think, lost the intimacy of the old space. And I agree, and that was something that we heard a lot, and something I think we took to heart in thinking about the new space. But people loved that aspect of the old museum. And I last week had made an hour to spare to wander through the new spaces, including your area, my area, European, Asian, which is largely installed now. And I'm happy to say that we have not, I think, lost that sense of intimacy. You still feel very much right next to the works of art in a way that is kind of wonderful. And that is something that will perhaps be a particular challenge for our security staff, but it's one that I think, easy for me to say, I suppose, but I think is worth it because it really does enhance the experience of being in a museum space if you can have those moments of real connection with things from other times and places. So I don't think, happily, that that's been lost.
Thank you. I think that is all we have time for now, and that feels like an appropriate moment to end. So, Ali, Karl, thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you will all make the trip to see the museum when it opens. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.